It is so disturbing.
Yeah, and you hear something like that, I can't. It's just, and these people, nothing happens, Pat, no jail. Woody Allen's walking around. This poor girl's ruined for her whole life.
Not so fast, hold your horses, reserve judgment.
10 institutions, these 5, 10, 15 names that we came up with, which one of them protects guys like Woody and Epstein the most?
Today we're talking about the long-standing allegations of abuse made against Woody Allen by his daughter Dylan, then aged 7. All is not what it seems. You may have heard about the allegations, so I won't go into details, but the other day I came across a popular podcast discussing the allegation and the presenter's apparent disgust at Woody. I welcome these kinds of podcasts and the alternative voices that they offer to the media space, and as far as I can tell, Valuetainment is a good thing. I wish them well and will watch their clips in the future. They seem genuine and committed to their work. However, when they were talking about the allegations against Woody Allen and linked him to Jeffrey Epstein, I got a little bit irked. So in this video, I'm going to share some documentary evidence and witness accounts that, for me, suggest Woody may be, dare I say, being set up. But by whom, you may ask? First, I will share a few clips, and then I'll dip in and out of an article or two and a blog by Moses Farrow.
So yesterday I was doing research for having you on, and just reading up, and then I saw a clip of Mia Farrow, who was she adopted her and
Sunyi Previn, and her daughter Dylan Farrow was molested.
Molested, and
in fact they're just allegations. In fact, there's only one allegation from Dylan, not from Sunyi Previn, who is now married to Woody Allen and has been for 30 years. I'll talk about her later.
When you're doing this type of research, I came up to a clip of the 90s of a leaked, like a tapped
I
audio.
haven't listened to it, but I've heard of it.
So
it's not a tapped phone call, it's a taped phone call, and no doubt taped by Mia Farrow. Again, we'll talk about that later.
And I showed it to Pat yesterday. I got emotional in this prep meeting because it's Mia Farrow and Woody Allen's on the phone, and she's telling.
Disturbing.
It's I'm gonna get emotional right now. She's crying. Mind you, this is her adopted daughter.
Yeah.
And describing what the rape and the abuse that he did to a 7-year-old girl.
They're talking about it as if it's fact. It's not. It's just an allegation.
And Pat heard this and he was in shock. We had to hear it twice. So if it's right, this is a tapped phone call.
Again, it's not tapped. It's taped. It'll be taped by Mia Farrow. She knew she was making the recording.
From Woody Allen talking to Mia Farrow, and they're talking about Dylan, who was the 7-year-old at the time, and what she went through.
Because you will not let me get it. You have to. It's way beyond that now.
Note the mood music.
What you've done to Suni, what you've done to Dylan, what you've done to Dylan. Dylan's a baby. How could you do that to her? I don't know anything of the kind. I know what Dylan tells me. You've told me nothing but lies. Dylan tells the truth inconsistently. No, I don't know that, Woody. I've always been worried about you and Dylan.
Is there any evidence of that, or is Mia Farrow suggesting that to imply there's been some sort of pattern of behaviour?
And I didn't know the doctor had to report this to the authorities. I didn't know that. I went just to be sure she was all right. And she's not all right, Woody. She walks around the house holding her vagina.
Now remember that. We're going to talk about later how the term private parts was used, and that came up in a visit to the doctor.
She sleeps with me. She's scared of you. And you hurt her. And I feel pretty guilty myself that I wasn't there to protect her.
Now we're going to hear later from Moses Farrow, who is there and can report on what happened on that particular day.
She said, Mommy, you didn't help me. She said, Daddy shouldn't have done that. He shouldn't have hurt me like that. If you hurt her, you would weep inside. And you would just want to be dead. Because I don't know how you can live with what you did.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that is so disturbing.
Yeah, and you hear something like that, I can't. It's just, and these people, nothing happens, Pat, no jail. Woody Allen's walking around. This poor girl's ruined for her whole life. that Epstein Island, all those girls, all those kids.
Okay, just hold your horses. We've got a bit of reading to do, so don't rush to judgment yet. I've got more to show you.
No accountability. These people just walk. Nothing happened. Two people got in trouble.
Cindy McCain in January 2020 she was in front of a stadium full of people. She said, we all knew what Jeffrey Epstein was doing.
Yeah.
All these people knew. This is why I get frustrated with the Wall Street Journal's reporting, because it's just like, they didn't even mention Woody Allen, how he married Soon-Yi Previn.
Yes, Woody Allen did marry Soon-Yi Previn, and they've been married for over 30 years very happily and have a couple of kids, I believe. I'll talk later about Soon-Yi.
They don't mention Dylan Farrow at all. Noam Chomsky gets called out on it. He's supposed to be this progressive icon, and he's like, Woody Allen's a great artist.
Yeah.
Don't ask me about my evening with a great artist and a convicted pedophile. Yeah. I mean, it's just... it's disgusting. And frankly, in my book, I talk about how...
So she has a book out. Okay, we understand that. Did she interview Moses Farrow?
Stop being so desensitized and get angry and outraged about what's happening. And what's happening to all... I mean, when you're talking about Epstein or like Woody Allen, these are kids. I mean, Dylan Farrow was 7, but court documents say he was sexually interested in her between the ages of 2 and 3.
3 years old.
What were those court documents? They weren't obviously provided by Woody Allen. They were presumably sourced by or provided by Mia Farrow and her team.
This is a guy people call a great artist and parade around and defend. It's sick. And I mean... 2 adopted kids. Soon-Yi Previn was his daughter too.
That's incorrect. Soon-Yi Previn was not Woody Allen's daughter. We'll talk about that later. Okay, let's get into the article. So this is a blog by Moses Farrow, an adopted son of Mia Farrow. And to me, this is the most compelling account of what's happened in the last 20-odd years. So I'm a very private person, Moses writes, and not at all interested in public attention. But given the incredibly inaccurate and misleading attacks on my father, Woody Allen, I feel that I can no longer stay silent as he continues to be condemned for a crime he did not commit. I was present for everything that transpired in our house before, during and after the alleged event. Now that the public hysteria of earlier this year has died down a little and I have some hope that the truth can get a fair hearing, I want to share my story. And so to the account of the day itself. August the 4th, 1992 was a warm, sunny day in Bridgewater, Connecticut, but in our family's country home, Frog Hollow, there was a chill in the air. My mother, Mia Farrow, was out shopping with her close friend since childhood, Casey Pascal. That's Moses, was 14 at the time and home that day with my little sister Dylan, who had just turned 7, my 4-year-old brother Satchel, who now goes by the name of Ronan, and Casey's 3 kids. We were being supervised by our nanny, Christy, as well as Casey's nanny, Alison, and our French tutor, Sophie. It was a full house. There was another grown-up in the TV room that day, sitting on the floor, watching Who Framed Roger Rabbit with the rest of us. That was Woody Allen. On the surface, it was not unlike his previous visits to our country home, but my mother had put us all on notice not to let him out of our sight. She was understandably furious. 7 months earlier, she had learned that he was in an intimate relationship with my 21-year-old sister, Soon-Yi, after discovering Polaroids of her in Woody's apartment. For months now, she had been drilling it into our heads like a mantra. Woody was evil, a monster, the devil, and Soon-Yi was dead to us. This was the constant refrain, whether or not Woody was around. So often did she repeat it that Satchel would announce to one of our nannies, "My sister is effing my father. He had just turned 4. My mother was our only source of information about Woody, and she was extremely convincing. As the oldest child at the house that summer day, I took Mia's warnings very seriously. I thought my job was to support my mother, and I desperately wanted her approval, as did all of her children. I had also learned repeatedly that to go against her wishes would bring horrible repercussions. I would keep my eyes on Woody until she returned, but secretly I was torn. To help explain why, I want to give you a little background about our family. Even though Woody and Mia never married, and he never lived with us, or even stayed the night at our apartment in the city, he would often come over around 6:30 in the morning, bringing 2 newspapers and a bunch of muffins. I would wake up before the others, and so he and I would sit at the kitchen table together for breakfast. While he read the New York Times, I'd grab the Post and go straight to the comics and the word puzzles. We'd spend this peaceful time together before waking Dylan. He'd make a couple of slices of toast with cinnamon or honey and be there as she ate her breakfast. He hardly seemed like a monster to me. My older siblings were either biological or adopted children of Mia and her ex-husband, Andre Previn. In 1985, Mia adopted Dylan. 2 years later, she and Woody had their only biological child, Satchel. At the age of 49, Woody seemed to delight in his new role of father. Then, of course, the news of Woody and Sun-Yi went public, and everything changed. My mother insisted that we remove both of them from our lives, and we had no choice but to accept. Even people who doubt Dylan's claims of assault often cling to Woody's relationship with Sun-Yi as justification for their skepticism about him. The public attacks on Sun-Yi by complete strangers still stagger me, as does the general misinformation that so many people consider fact. She is not Woody's daughter, adopted, step or otherwise, nor is she developmentally challenged. She got a master's degree in special education from Columbia University, and the claim that they started dating while she was underage is totally false. In truth, Woody and Sun-Yi rarely even spoke during her childhood. It was my mother who first suggested, when Sun-Yi was 20, that Woody reach out and spend some time with her. He agreed and started taking her to Knicks games. That's how their romance started. Yes, it was unorthodox, uncomfortable, disruptive to our family, and it hurt my mother terribly, but the relationship itself was not nearly as devastating to our family as my mother's insistence on making this betrayal the centre of all our lives from then on. But the fatal dysfunction within my childhood home had nothing to do with Woody. It began long before he entered the picture and came straight from a deep and persistent darkness within the Farrow family. Okay, so there's a few paragraphs on Mia Farrow herself and the way she treated her family. I think this is important, so I'll read it and include it. Do skip ahead if you don't find it relevant, but I do think it's relevant for who the offender might be in this situation. So the article continues. It was common knowledge in Hollywood that my grandfather, the director John Farrow, was a notorious drinker and a serial philanderer. There were numerous alcohol-fueled arguments between her parents, and Mia told me that she was the victim of an attempted molestation within her own family. Her brother, my Uncle John, who visited us many times when we were young, is currently in prison for a conviction of multiple child molestation charges. My mother has never publicly commented on this or expressed concern about his victims. My Uncle Patrick and his family would often come by, but those visits would end abruptly as Mia and Patrick would often wind up arguing. Patrick would commit suicide in 2009. My mother, of course, had her own darkness. She married 50-year-old Frank Sinatra when she was only 21. After they divorced, she moved in to live with her close friend Dory Previn and her husband Andre. When my mother became pregnant by Andre, the Previns' marriage broke up, leading to Dory's institutionalization. It was never spoken of in our home, of course, and not even known to me until a few years ago. But as I look at it, as a licensed therapist as well as an eyewitness, it's easy to see the seeds of dysfunction that would flourish within our own home. So there you have it. So you have Mia doing similar things to Sun-Yi by marrying a man decades older and then breaking up a marriage of those people who came to her help, namely the Previns. The article continues. It was important to my mother to project to the world a picture of happy blended household of both biological and adopted children. This was far from the truth. I'm sure my mother had good intentions in adopting children with disabilities from the direst of circumstances, but the reality inside our walls was very different. It pains me to recall instances in which I witnessed siblings, some blind or physically disabled, dragged down a flight of stairs to be thrown into a bedroom or a closet, then having the door locked from the outside. She even shut my brother Thaddeus, a paraplegic from polio, in an outdoor shed overnight as punishment for a minor transgression. Sun-Yi was her most frequent scapegoat. My sister had an independent streak and, of all of us, was the least intimidated by Mia. When pushed, she would call our mother out on her behaviour and ugly arguments would ensue. When Sun-Yi was young, Mia once threw a large porcelain centrepiece at her head. Luckily it missed, but the shattered pieces hit her legs. Years later, Mia beat her with a telephone receiver. Sun-Yi's made it clear that her desire was simply to be left alone, which increasingly became the case. Even if her relationship with Woody was unconventional, it allowed her to escape. Others weren't so lucky. If this isn't a record of abuse, I don't know what is. We continue. Most media sources claim my sister Tam died of heart failure at the age of 21. In fact, Tam struggled with depression for much of her life, a situation exacerbated by my mother, Mia, refusing to get her help, insisting that Tam was just moody. One afternoon in 2000, after one final fight with Mia, which ended with my mother leaving the house, Tam committed suicide by overdosing on pills. My mother would tell others that the drug overdose was accidental, saying that Tam, who was blind, didn't know which pills she was taking. But Tam had both an ironclad memory and a sense of spatial recognition, and of course, blindness didn't impair her ability to count. So are you seeing a pattern yet? The article continues. The details of Tam's overdose and the fight with Mia that precipitated it were relayed directly to me by my brother, Thaddeus, a first-hand witness. Tragically, he is no longer able to confirm this account. Just 2 years ago, Thaddeus also committed suicide by shooting himself in his car less than 10 minutes from my mother's house. My sister Lark was another fatality. She wound up on the path of self-destruction, struggled with addiction, and eventually died in poverty from AIDS-related causes in 2008 at the age of 35. For all of us, life under my mother's roof was impossible if you didn't do exactly what you were told, no matter how questionable the demand. And Moses Farrow gives another example, one of his own. I was getting ready to go to sleep when my mother came over to my bed and found a tape measure. She gave me a piercing look that stopped me in my tracks and asked if I had taken it, as she had been looking for it all day. I stood in front of her, frozen. She asked why it was on my bed. I told her I didn't know, that perhaps a workman had left it there. She asked again and again and again. When I didn't give the answer she wanted, she slapped my face, knocking off my glasses. She told me I was lying and directed me to tell my brothers and sisters that I had taken the tape measure. Through my tears, I listened to her as she explained that we would rehearse what should have happened. She would walk into the room and I would tell her I was sorry for taking the tape measure, that I had taken it to play with, and that I would never do it again. She made me rehearse it at least a half dozen times. That was the start of her coaching, drilling, scripting and rehearsing. In essence, brainwashing. I became anxious and fearful. Once, when I was given a new pair of jeans, I thought they would look cool if I cut off a couple of the belt loops. When Mia saw what I had done, she spanked me repeatedly and had me remove all of my clothing, saying, "You're not deserving of any clothes," and making me stand naked in the corner of her room in front of my older siblings who had just returned from dinner with their father, Andre. After I spoke to People magazine in 2014 about how I was treated, Dylan called it a betrayal and said that I was dead to her. She later publicly dismissed my recollections of my childhood as irrelevant. This from a woman who now styles herself as an advocate for abuse victims. Fighting back was not a viable option. One summer day, Mia accused me of leaving the curtains closed in the TV room. They had been drawn the day before when Dylan and Satchel were watching a movie. She insisted that I had closed them and left them that way. Her friend Casey had come over to visit, and while they were in the kitchen, my mother insisted I had shut the curtains. At that point, I couldn't take it anymore and I lost it, yelling, "You're lying." She shot me a look and took me into the bathroom next to the TV room. She hit me uncontrollably all over my body. She slapped me, pushed me backwards and hit me on the chest, shouting, "How dare you say I'm a liar in front of my friend? You're the pathological liar." I was defeated, deflated, beaten and beaten down. Mia had stripped me of my voice and my sense of self. It was clear that if I stepped even slightly outside her carefully crafted reality, she would not tolerate it. It was an upbringing that made me, paradoxically, both fiercely loyal and obedient to her, as well as deeply afraid. In short, it was not a happy home or a healthy one, which brings us back to August the 4th, 1992. Strangers on Twitter posed me this question all the time. You weren't there to witness the assault, so how do you know it didn't happen? But how could anyone witness an assault if it never happened? As the man of the house that day, I had promised to keep an eye out for trouble, and I was doing just that. I remember where Woody sat in the TV room, and I can picture where Dylan and Satchel were. Not that everybody stayed glued to the same spot, but I deliberately made sure to note everyone's coming and going. I do remember that Woody would leave the room on occasion, but never with Dylan. He would wander into another room to make a phone call, read the paper, use the bathroom, or step outside to get some air and walk around the large pond on the property. Along with 5 kids, there were 3 adults in the house, all of whom had been told for months what a monster Woody was. None of us would have allowed Dylan to step away with Woody, even if he tried. Casey's nanny, Alison, would later claim that she walked into the TV room and saw Woody kneeling on the floor with his head in Dylan's lap on the couch. Really? With all of us in there? If she had witnessed that, why wouldn't she have said something immediately to our nanny Christy? I also remember some discussion of this act perhaps taking place on the staircase that led to Mia's room. Again, this would have been in full view of anyone who entered the living room, assuming Woody managed to walk off with Dylan in the first place. The narrative had to be changed, since the only place for anyone to commit an act of depravity in private would have been in a small crawl space off my mother's upstairs bedroom. By default, the attic became the scene of the alleged assault. In her widely circulated 2014 open letter to the New York Times, the adult Dylan suddenly seemed to remember every moment of the alleged assault, writing, "He told me to lay on my stomach and play with my brother's electric train set. Then he sexually assaulted me. He talked to me while he did it, whispering that I was a good girl, that this was our secret, promising that we'd go to Paris and I'd be a star in his movies. I remember staring at the toy train, focusing on it as it travelled in its circle around the attic. To this day, I find it difficult to look at toy trains." It's a precise and compelling narrative, but there's a major problem. There was no electric train in that attic. There was, in fact, no way for kids to play up there, even if we had wanted to. It was an unfinished crawl space under a steeply angled gabled roof, with exposed nails and floorboards, billows of fiberglass insulation filled with mouse traps and droppings, and stinking of mothballs, and crammed with trunks full of hand-me-down clothes and my mother's old wardrobes. The idea that the space could possibly have accommodated a functioning electric train set circling around the attic is ridiculous. One of my brothers did have an elaborate model train set, but it was set up in the boys' room, a converted garage on the first floor. Maybe that was the train set my sister thinks she remembers. Now, whenever I hear Dylan making a public statement about what allegedly happened to her that day when she was barely 7, I can only think of that imaginary train set, which he never brought up during the original investigation or custody hearing. Did somebody suggest to the adult Dylan that such a specific detail would make her story more credible? Or does she really believe she remembers this train circling around the attic the same way she remembers Woody's whispered promises of trips to Paris and movie stardom? And all this apparently took place while those of us who promised to have our eyes trained on Woody were downstairs seemingly oblivious to what was happening right above our heads. Eventually my mother returned with Casey and her newest adoptees, Tam and baby Isaiah. There were no complaints by the nannies and nothing odd about Dylan's behaviour. In fact, Woody and Mia went out to dinner that night. After dinner, they returned to Frog Hollow and Woody stayed over in a downstairs bedroom with, apparently, no abnormal behaviour by Dylan and no negative reports from any of the grown-ups. Then there's a paragraph about the recollections of perfectly normal activities the following morning, and then the article goes on. Interestingly, it was only after Woody returned to the city that Mia would receive a phone call that would change our lives forever. It was from her friend Casey, who reported that her nanny, Alison, had witnessed Woody supposedly placing his head in Dylan's lap on the sofa in the TV room. When Monica, our long-term nanny, who was out that day, returned to work the next day, I confided to her that I thought the story was made up. Monica, who had been with us for 6 years, would quit her job a few months later, saying that Mia was pressuring her to take her side and support the accusation. It was Monica, this is the long-term nanny, who later testified that she saw Mia taping Dylan describe how Woody had supposedly touched her in the attic, saying it took Mia 2 or 3 days to make the recording. In her testimony, she, Monica, said, "I recall Ms. Farrow saying to Dylan at that time, 'Dylan, what did Daddy do? What did he do next?' Dylan appeared not to be interested, and Miss Farrow would stop taping for a while and then continue." I can vouch for this, having witnessed some of the process myself. When another one of Dylan's therapists, Dr. Nancy Schultz, criticised the making of the video and questioned the legitimacy of the content, she too was fired immediately by Mia. My mother, for whom loyalty was hugely important, would also fire another long-term caretaker, Mavis, claiming that she was making statements against her. Okay, we're going to go on a slight detour now. I'm going to show you another document. I'll come back to the article shortly, but this is a report by the Yale New Haven Hospital titled Child S. Abuse Clinic Evaluation of Dylan Farrow. Dylan Farrow was referred to the Child S. Abuse Clinic of the Yale New Haven Hospital in September 1992. The referral was made by the police, blah, blah, blah. At the meeting, the history and that the police had at the time was briefly presented, and the videotape taken by Ms. Farrow of Dylan telling what had reportedly happened to her was reviewed. Two major questions that were posed in the referral were: is Dylan telling the truth, and did we think that she had been abused? To determine the meaning of Dylan's statements and whether they were true, we interviewed her on 9 occasions. In addition, because of family context and Dylan's past psychiatric history, that's interesting, of a 7-year-old, are important to understanding the meaning of her statements, we met with both of her parents, 2 babysitters and 2 psychotherapists who had evaluated and treated Dylan and Satchel. Then there's a chronology of the evaluation. In summary, Dylan presented as an intelligent, verbal 7-year-old whose storytelling was quite elaborate and fantasy-like at times, and who manifested loose associations in her thinking. She appeared confused about what to relate to the interviewers and was very controlling of what she would say. In her statements and her play, she elaborated interrelated themes. She was upset by the loss of her father and Sunyi and worried that her father might take her away from her mother's care. She felt protective of and worried for her mother. Dylan was very much attuned to her mother's pain, and her mother reinforced Dylan's losses and her negative view of her father. Assessment of whether Dylan was abused. It is our expert opinion that Dylan was not abused by Mr. Allen. Further, we believe that Dylan's statements on videotape and her statements to us during the evaluation do not refer to actual events that occurred to her on the 4th of August 1992. Our initial impression was formulated in December 1992 before reviewing any outside materials and before meeting with anyone outside the family except the police and a babysitter. Our opinion was reinforced by the additional information that we gathered throughout the rest of the evaluation. In developing our opinion, we considered 3 hypotheses to explain Dylan's statements. First, that Dylan's statements were true and that Mr. Allen had abused her. Second, that Dylan's statements were not true but were made up by an emotionally vulnerable child who was caught up in a disturbed family and who was responding to the stresses of the family. And third, that Dylan was coached or influenced by her mother, Ms. Farrow. While we can conclude that Dylan was not abused, we cannot be definitive about whether the second formulation by itself or the third formulation by itself is true. We believe that it is more likely that a combination of these 2 formulations best explains Dylan's allegations of abuse. The major reasons for our opinion that Dylan was not abused are the following. There were important inconsistencies in Dylan's statements in the videotape and in her statements to us. She appeared to struggle with how to tell about the touching. She told the story in a manner that was overly thoughtful and controlling. There was no spontaneity in her statements, and a rehearsed quality was suggested in how she spoke. And finally, her descriptions of the details surrounding the alleged events were unusual and were inconsistent. Okay, now another slight detour to a Guardian article dating to 2020. Moses Farrow, I'd be very happy to take my father's surname. In his first newspaper interview, the adopted son of Mia Farrow and Woody Allen talks about an atmosphere of anger and hatred in his family, the problems of transracial adoption, and his certainty that his sister was not abused by their father. I'm not going to go through the whole of this article, but I'm going to pull out a few paragraphs. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to check it out yourself. In recent years, the public's focus has shifted to the molestation allegation, with battle duties delegated to the family's second generation. In 2014, Dylan wrote an article for the New York Times detailing Allen's alleged assault, Woody Allen led me into a dim closet-like attic and so on and so forth, and talks about the electric train set, which we've spoken about before. In 2016, Ronan wrote an article accusing the media of ignoring Dylan's allegation just because Allen had never been convicted or charged. The article then talks about Moses publishing his blog, which we're looking at, and also refers to the deaths of a couple of his siblings. There was abuse in his family, he wrote, but it did not come from his father. His mother, he wrote, this is Moses, was physically abusive to the children, and she brainwashed them, punishing them until they said what she told them to, even if they knew it was a lie. The article goes on. Dylan replied to Moses' blog saying, "My brother is a troubled person," and Ronan dismissed it as part of the repeated campaign to discredit my sister, often by attacking my mother. Sun Yi then gave an interview backing up her brother's, Moses' claims about Mia being abusive. This links to the article in Vulture, and I'll put a link in the description, introducing Sun Yi Previn. As controversies tumbled around her, the daughter of Mia Farrow and the wife of Woody Allen stayed silent for decades, no more. And in that Sun Yi article, it says, more than a quarter century after the public learned of the affair that broke every taboo, in the words of a child psychiatrist, Paulina Kerberg, the 47-year-old Sun Yi is ending her silence. She's long believed that her relationship with Allen fueled the inquiry into the allegations surrounding Dylan, but only recently has she felt compelled to tell her own side of things and to talk about what drove her away from her adoptive mother, Mia Farrow, and towards the man who's now been her husband for 20 years. And it goes on, what happened to Woody is so upsetting, so unjust. Mia has taken advantage of the Me Too movement and paraded Dylan as a victim, and a whole generation is hearing about it when they shouldn't. Back to the Guardian article, of the Pharaoh Previn children, only Moses and Sun Yi have publicly cast doubt on the molestation allegation, but they are far from the only people to do so. It is easy to forget now, in an era when Allen's guilt is widely assumed as a given, but Allen was twice cleared of the allegation. He was investigated by the Yale New Haven Hospital's abuse clinic. We've read that, which stated the expert opinion that Dylan was not molested. He was also submitted to a 14-month investigation by New York City's Child Welfare Administration. It concluded no credible evidence was found that child named in this report has been abused or maltreated. Now, you may remember what I said earlier in the video about the term private parts, so this is the relevant paragraph. This is a matter of public record. In a widely read interview with Mia in Vanity Fair, the journalist Maureen Orth writes that after Dylan said her father touched her on her private part, her paediatrician asked where her private part was. Dylan pointed to her shoulder. Mia and Dylan then left the doctor's office and went for an ice cream. Orth writes that, according to people close to the situation, Dylan told her mother that she had been embarrassed in the doctor's office. When they returned the next day, Dylan indicated to the doctor that Allen had touched her between her legs. The doctor examined Dylan and found that she was intact, Orth writes, yet he was obliged to call the police and report it. And you may remember the taped phone call in which Mia says she didn't know the doctor had to report it. Well, I'm not so sure. Back to the article, The Sun speaks out by Moses Farrow, so the detour is now over. During the custody hearing, my mother kept stressing how we needed to stick together as a family. Frightened and beaten down, I too played my part. I even wrote a letter condemning Woody, saying that he had done something horrible and unforgivable and had broken my dreams. I even read the letter for the news media that were now regularly gathered at the end of our driveway, knowing that doing so would earn my mother's approval. That public denouncement of my father remains the biggest regret of my life. Moses continues, later that year, I remember many meetings with lawyers and an evaluation I went to in New Jersey. I'm naturally shy and kept quiet until I finally felt the need to speak up. I told the evaluator that I felt stuck between my parents. Afterwards, I returned to my school and my mother called, screaming, "Do you realise what you've done? You've destroyed my case. You need to call your lawyer and tell her you take back what you said. Tell her you recant your statements and want them stricken from the record." I felt my stomach drop, says Moses. When I next spoke to the lawyer, I repeated her words, Mia's, verbatim. I take back what I said, I recant my statements and want them stricken from the record. Again, the pattern held. I was forced to follow my mother's script to prove my loyalty. Moses continues, at the time, of course, I knew nothing about the 6-month criminal investigation conducted by the child abuse clinic of the Yale New Haven Hospital, ordered by the police, the state police. But since this allegation was renewed a few years ago, I've seen the results of that investigation. It specifically concluded that Dylan was not abused by Mr. Allen and that her statements had a rehearsed quality and that they were likely coached or influenced by her mother. Now, we've seen that document just 5 or so minutes ago. Those conclusions perfectly match my own childhood experience. Coaching, influencing, and rehearsing are 3 words that sum up exactly how my mother tried to raise us. I know that Dylan has recently referred to this brainwashing theory as spin by our father, but it was nothing of the sort. It was not only the conclusion reached by the state-ordered investigation, it was the reality of life in our household. That report put an end to any chance of criminal charges being brought against my father. A second 14-month investigation, again as we've discussed earlier, as referred to in Sun Yi's article, by the New York State Department of Social Services reached the same conclusion as the Yale New Haven report. No credible evidence was found that Dylan Farrow had been abused or maltreated. Nevertheless, a judge granted custody of Satchel, now Ronan, and Dylan to Mia at 15. I chose the path of least resistance and also stayed with my mother. In my mid-20s, shortly after I graduated from my master's program, I felt that I wanted to reach out to Woody and communicated this to Mia. I'll never forget how happy I felt when I received her return email saying she would support it, understanding my need for a father figure. That happiness was short-lived. Less than 24 hours later, she reconsidered and wrote back saying that she forbade me from making contact with that monster. Moses then talks about his awakening to the truth. I'm grateful to have been awakened to that truth of what happened to us, but disappointed that it took me this long to get here. Meanwhile, though my father continues to face wave after wave of unfair and unrelenting attacks from my mother and her surrogates, questioning why he has been given a pass all of these years, but Woody was not given a pass. Quite the opposite. Mia's accusation was fully investigated by 2 separate agencies and charges were never brought. Mia reached the end of her legal runway after it was determined that the abuse never occurred. But trial by media thrives on the lack of long-term memory, and Twitter requires neither knowledge nor restraint. Okay, nearly coming to the end of this article, just a few more paragraphs. To those who have become convinced of my father's guilt, I ask you to consider this. In this time of Me Too, when so many movie heavyweights have faced dozens of accusations, my father has been accused of wrongdoing only once by an enraged ex-partner during contentious custody negotiations. During almost 60 years in the public eye, not one other person has come forward to accuse him of even behaving badly on a date or acting inappropriately in any professional situation, let alone molesting a child. As a trained professional, I know that child molestation is a compulsive sickness and deviation that demands repetition. Dylan was alone with Woody in his apartment countless times over the years without a hint of impropriety, yet some would have you believe that at the age of 56, he suddenly decided to become a child molester in a house full of hostile people ordered to watch him like a hawk. To the actors who have worked with my father and have voiced regret for doing so, you have rushed to join the chorus of condemnation based on a discredited accusation for fear of not being on the right side of a major social movement. But rather than accept the hysteria of Twitter mobs mindlessly repeating a story examined and discredited 25 years ago, please consider what I have to say. After all, I was there, in the house, in the room, and I know both my father and mother and what each is capable of a whole lot better than you. Okay, let's have a quick look at the list of actors who've publicly expressed regret for working with Woody Allen. Some I know, some I have no idea who they are. Hayley Atwell said she regretted working with Allen on his 2007 film, Cassandra's Dream. I stand in solidarity with his daughter and offer an apology to her if my contribution to his work has caused her suffering or made her feel dismissed in any way. Rachel Brosnahan, I don't know her. Look, I had a great experience on that project, but I do have to take this opportunity to say that for me, I really struggled with the decision to do that project for a long time. Michael Caine for Hannah and her sisters. This is very disappointing. I'm so stunned. I can't come to terms with it because I love Woody and had a wonderful time with him. I don't regret working with him, which I did in complete innocence, but I wouldn't work with him again, no. Timothy Chalamet, A Rainy Day in New York, made in 2018. The rising star of made A Rainy Day with Allen during the summer of 2017. In an Instagram post, he followed his co-stars Rebecca Hall and Griffin Newman in expressing regret for working on the film and pledging his salary to a charity. Colin Firth, this is another disappointing one. I wouldn't work with him again, he said, apparently. Greta Gerwig saying she regretted working with Alan and seemed to fumble a bit, saying it was something I've thought deeply about and I care deeply about, and I haven't even had an opportunity to have an in-depth discussion where I come down on one side or the other. 2 days later, she gave a different response. If I had known then what I know now, I would not have acted in the film. I have not worked for him again, and I will not work for him again. Rebecca Hall, who starred in 2 of his films, voiced her regret and pledged her salary to Time's Up. David Krumholtz, I deeply regret working with Woody Allen on Wonder Wheel. It is one of my most heartbreaking mistakes. We can no longer let these men represent us in entertainment, politics, or in any other realm. They are beneath real men. Griffin Newman, I need to get this off my chest. I worked on Woody Allen's next movie. I believe he's guilty. I donated my entire salary to a charity. I spent a whole month debating whether or not to quit. I deeply regret my final decision. It was an educational experience for all the wrong reasons. I learned conclusively that I cannot put my career over my morals again. Elliot Page, I did a Woody Allen movie and it is the biggest regret of my career. Peter Sarsgaard, I wouldn't do another Allen film. Mia Sorvino, Evan Rachel Wood. The only person, or one of the people who've come out on Woody's side is Diane Keaton. I have nothing to say about the story, and I believe my friend. She's quoted at length elsewhere. Marion Cotillard is another. I didn't know much about his personal life. I knew that he had married one of his daughters, which is false, which I thought honestly was weird, but I cannot judge something I don't know. But I have to say, if he asked me today, I would question more, I would dig more. I'm very ignorant about the story, and I just see that it hurts to see people suffering. Well, she could do some research. She could read Moses Farrow's blog for a start. Back to the final 2 paragraphs of the article of the blog. To my sister Dylan, like you, I believe in the power of speaking out. I've broken my silence about the abuse inflicted by our mother. My healing began only after getting away from her, and what she has done to you is unbearable. I wish you peace and the wisdom to understand that devoting your life to helping our mother destroy our father's reputation is unlikely to bring you closure in any kind of lasting way. Finally, to my mother, one thing you always said you appreciated about me was my ability to listen. I listened to you for years and held your truth above all others. You once said to me, it's not healthy to hold on to anger. Yet here we are, 26 years later. I'm guessing your next step will be to launch a campaign to discredit me for speaking out. I know it comes with the territory, and it's a burden I am willing to bear. And there you have it. Watching podcasts, remember the story from the other side, don't jump to conclusions, reserve judgment, and in the case of Woody Allen, I think this account is much more compelling.
If you heard her, you would weep inside. And you would just want to be dead. Because I don't know how you can live with what you did.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that is so disturbing.
Yeah, you hear something like that, I can't. It's just, and these people, nothing happens, Pat, no jail. Woody Allen's walking around. This poor girl's ruined for her whole life.
10 institutions. These 5, 10, 15 names that we came up with. Which one of them protects guys like Woody and Epstein the most?
God rest their souls.
It's just so sad.
That's why I think you're inspiring a lot of other people that want to be like you. And
well,
you may not even
like
know
I
this.
say, the first step is to get angry.
Yep.
So many Americans have been, we're stimulated all this stuff with like these action movies and death.
There will come a time when Woody will go to the great movie studio in the sky. I hope that when people and the media reflect on his life, they do him justice. If you've made it this far, well done, congratulations, and do keep on spreading the word about Woody's predicament and others. All the usual, subscribe and like and everything and all that rubbish. All the best until next time. Thank you for tuning in. Please do like and subscribe. And of course, if you or a loved one are experiencing legal troubles yourself, I hope you found this channel and video useful, and the very best of luck. Thanks.